Hello, everybody. Brendan Marcello here once again for another episode of Social Distance here on 24/7 Sports. Our guest is Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott. We're going to discuss a lot of things, a lot of this is unprecedented times on a lot of reasons. But as we record this, it's June 1st. The NCAA is allowing players to return for voluntary workouts. Of course, conferences have decided to make their own dates and their guidelines upon that. The Pac-12 approaching that day, June 15th, some schools still trying to figure out what they can do with that. But how do you feel about your member institutions as they gear up for voluntary workouts and with that, the protocols they've got in place to help protect the players?
Yeah, we've aligned as a league around June 15 being the earliest date that restrictions would be lifted for voluntary workouts. We feel pretty good about it, but there's of course trepidation. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot that's unknown about how this is going to work. But I think this decision was made, out of an abundance of concern for student athletes, who many of whom are in states where restrictions are starting to be lifted and gyms are open and they're allowed to go out and interact more. And I think there's a sense listening to our student athletes and campus leadership that there are many student athletes that would prefer to be back on campus, feel like they could get better medical support, certainly strength and conditioning training, and be better prepared when official team activities are allowed. So, I'm proud of our schools and the way they've ramped up to gear for this. We're fortunate. We've got very strong medical support at a lot of our schools, a lot of university hospitals, medical research centers, and extraordinary medical care. So I think it'll be up to be done as safely as one could imagine right now, with appropriate precautions in place. But I know there's a lot of, relief for some of our student athletes, particularly those that are in hardship situations at home.
Are there any states, because obviously where you're at in the Bay Area, you're still with a shelter-in-place order, you're working from home like many people, but are there any states within your footprint that still concern you, worry you as you guys kind of approach the June 15th date and then also go into July as you try to ramp up and be ready for a season?
Yeah, I mean, every state is a little bit different in our part of the country, like in other parts of the country. Right now, 4 of our states have gyms open. All of our states, have started reopening procedures. Washington and California are the 2 that don't have gyms open yet, but have indicated that, pro sports, they could see coming back as early as June. So right now, I've got reason to be, let's say, cautiously optimistic that all of our states sometime in June are going to allow their campuses to allow for voluntary workouts. I mean, just in the Bay Area here, for example, the Warriors were recently told they could open their training facility. In LA, the teams were told they can open up their facilities in the coming weeks. So all indications are quite positive that, by the end of June, let's say, all of our facilities will be open if the campuses choose to allow student athletes to come back for voluntary workouts. And then in July to start team activities once we settle on all the dates.
What are your feelings on uniformity and testing? Because I know a lot of schools, for example, some in the SEC, they're deciding to not test student athletes when they first return to campus. And just actually a few minutes ago as we record this, it's been reported that a student athlete at Marshall has tested positive for coronavirus upon their arrival, and they're asymptomatic. They had no idea. There's obviously some concerns there. If you're not testing, asymptomatic people that have contracted the virus can easily spread it, and then other people can get sick. Do you want to see some uniformity within your conference and also other conferences about how you test, when you test, and should every school in the Pac-12 test their student athletes before they begin voluntary workouts?
Yeah, we are going to have uniformity in the Pac-12. We've got a very strong medical advisory committee made up of our team docs and trainers, but we've got 7 or 8 infectious disease experts that are associated with these, great university hospitals, medical research centers. They're specialists in this area, and the collaboration has been terrific. And there are some Pac-12 guidelines that do mandate that all student athletes are tested when they come back to campus, as well as regular testing beyond that. I think at the moment, it'll be weekly testing for the reason you mentioned. Just having symptoms, we've learned, is not an indicator. So taking someone's temperature or going through a checklist, which they'll do daily anyway, to look for symptoms. But there is some data I've heard from our experts that there's kind of 3 or 4 days of, I'm learning a lot through this process, something called virus shedding. That happens, which is when, your others can catch it from you. That happens before you even show symptoms. So the idea of checking, if you follow that logic, the idea of checking symptoms, it's too late. If you got a symptom, you've probably been infectious a few days before that. So for that reason and others, there will be testing. There's also going to be antibody testing for all student athletes when they come back, for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, if you've had the virus, there's a heightened level of concern, cardiac, lung, and there's going to be other screenings and protocols for the if you might have some antibody, that would be good to know as well. So we are going to have a consistent testing protocol. And then, we'll go from there. These will continue to evolve. I guess I should underscore that. We're learning a lot, but I feel like we've got some pretty solid protocols for at least how a return to voluntary workouts goes and the reopening of our facilities.
Yeah, I don't think that's been talked a lot about. I mean, we everybody knows about the antibody testing, but the after effects of the virus, if they've had it, as far as you said, with cardiovascular, it's some reports say it's affecting people's lungs long term. There's damage, and you've got protocols to kind of go about doing that. I guess, would it be similar to maybe what we see like at the NFL Combine, where they're going through medical screenings with the doctors there and everything like that, where they're testing and poking and prodding every little thing to make sure there's no underlying conditions?
Yeah, I can't probably very well describe exactly what it'll look like and what that additional screening and testing looks like on our campus. I'm not expert enough to describe that, but the fact that there are additional tests and protocols that will be kicked in if someone is showing the antibody is what I'm aware of.
I spoke recently with your colleague Greg Sankey with the SEC, and obviously no one wants to be like, here are the contingency plans we have in place for the college football season, because there's so many, obviously, and the number one goal is to play, and one, to play on time. But what is the most radical idea that has been discussed that have come up in these meetings?
Well, there's a whole spectrum, as Greg would have shared with you, and we're discussing those together. Probably the most extreme is, not being able to play a full season, so a compressed season. I mean, to me, we're in a bad state of affairs if we decide that it's just going to be an abbreviated minimal season, and we can't have non-conference play, can't have bowl games, can't have college football playoff, and we just maybe each play our conference seasons in whatever form or shape we can. That's probably the worst case scenario where there's a season. Obviously, the worst case scenario is we can never get comfortable, or we're not allowed, more likely, by public health officials to play. At this stage, that would mean, I believe, is we've had a real setback as a country in dealing with this public health crisis, because right now we're certainly on a trajectory where Major League Baseball is going to start in July, NBA is going to, looks like, have a playoff at the end of July, NFL is going to start. So if we're at the point where we can't play college football, that means all sports, I believe, are shut down and won't be able to play.
I know a couple of your coaches have mentioned that there's been discussions about maybe doing an 11-game conference schedule. And there's been a lot of people out there that just say, hey, maybe college football is more regional this year, where you're almost adjusting on the fly with scheduling. Do you foresee that happening? And is that one of your, the plans you guys have really got to focus on and build upon right now?
Well, I think we're being very diligent in looking at every scenario, but there's scenario A, B, C, D, and E. I think that scenario is more around like a D and E, I think what's much more likely at the moment is that we're playing a full college football season. I mean, that's if you ask me to handicap, I'd say that's the most likely scenario at the moment, given um, the plans of the other pro sports leagues, the reaction from our public health officials and political leaders, and our campuses. Most all of our campuses are planning to open up in some way, and based on the advice of our medical community. So I've got reason to be optimistic. We're looking at plan A or B rather than D and E, but the due diligence has been extraordinary by our teams looking at these things. And because you'll have to be nimble and ready to pivot too. I don't think anyone can predict exactly what's going to happen here. And you might start one way, but might have to hit the pause button or adjust to another scenario, depending on what happens with the virus, second wave, what have you. But at the moment, we've got reason to be optimistic we'll play a full season.
Any concern about neutral site games, and specifically USC and Alabama? Because I know that's a huge one early in the season, yep. And obviously some of that stuff's even out of your own control because of the site, right, and where it's at.
Well, I'd say neutral site games and away non-conference games raise similar questions. It means there's going to need to be an extraordinary level of collaboration, but also trust and confidence that the protocols that you're holding yourself to and your colleagues in your conference to when it comes to hygiene and sanitizing locker rooms and spaces, and your testing protocols to ensure that you've done everything reasonably possible to make sure that no player that steps on a field or staff member or official has a virus, that you've taken all those reasonable steps based on your protocols. You'll want to know that the other team has taken the same steps. And so that's going to require a level of collaboration and agreement that is not always so easy in college sports, but I think people realize the importance of it. And I'm optimistic we'll get there. We, in addition to, daily communication I've got with the commissioners and the other A5 conferences, we meet as the FBS, we're meeting as the NCA. We also have our medical advisory groups meeting. Mm-hmm. And I think the goal is to come up with a common set of protocols, certainly for non-conference play.
A little, not off topic, but moving to basketball real quick. I know that there is a game scheduled in China between Washington and Tulane. Is that game still on right now?
Well, the game's scheduled, and we have not canceled it or made a change, but I think there's obviously a real question as to whether we'll be at a place where we feel it's safe and our teams want to travel to China. So we're working on some backup plans where the game will be played in this country. So both teams are playing each other. The question is where.
We're going through a heartbreaking time in this country on a lot of levels, and here more recently with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and has sparked an outcry of people wanting their voices to be heard, protests, some violent, mostly peaceful. Obviously on the West Coast and the bigger cities, there's been quite a few protests. Student athletes, of course, have raised their voices. You're seeing coaches speaking out more than ever about injustices. Number one, your take on the entire situation of what's going on in our country right now. And number two, your feelings on what is probably a real possibility that during a college football season, you'll probably see some form of protest from players within your conference.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly horrified and shocked to have seen that, in 2020, what happened to George Floyd could happen in this country. I think we'd all like to have thought that we've made more progress as a country in terms of hate and racism, police brutality. And I think what's just so horrifying and shocking is, having videotaped the whole thing and to see the bystanders in addition to the perpetrator in this case. And I think people are craving justice and are hoping to use this moment appropriately as an inflection point to say, when is enough going to be enough? And when are we going to see some more meaningful progress here? And I think people are scared. They're upset. I think the whole thing is exacerbated by this whole COVID situation and people's isolation and frustration probably around the restrictions on employment. I mean, you know, the tensions in this country are at such a height. It seems to have exploded. The whole thing's obviously, you know, very hurtful for a lot of people, and confusing when peaceful protests turn into violent protests and riots and looting as well. And I, for one, certainly hope that that doesn't cause us to lose focus on what the most important messages should be around, you know, race in this country, and what are we going to do to improve it. So we're having a lot of discussion. It's only been a few days, obviously, within our league, about what we can do. And it starts with listening and understanding the perspective, and certainly as a white male, understanding the perspective of our student athletes, coaches, other administrators that you know, feel this and feel the hurt and pain and frightened in a way that's, you know, hard for me to understand. So we're meeting with student athlete groups, meeting with campus leaders, talking to coaches, and trying to figure out what we can do at the league level to support the conversations, the dialogue, and then figure out how to turn it into action. You know, out west, you know, there's a pretty progressive attitude when it comes to social justice, and I think a desire to lean in. You know, ours is a league that has had athletes like Jackie Robinson, Arthur Ashe, barrier breakers. And I think there's a desire to lean in on this issue and figure out what can we do to advance the discussion, but also figure out a way to turn it into action. I don't know what form that'll take, but we're going to be very active listeners.
One of those forms could be, you know, protests by players, whether it's an individual basis or doing something. Are you okay with that? Are you going to discuss that with your players, or are you just like, hey, speak your mind. We want you to speak your mind.
We are always supportive of our student athletes using their platform to speak out and to try to advocate for change. And I think, you know, sports and the role of our student athletes, I mean, it's a microcosm of our universities generally. I mean, I think that's the way our universities look at their role. We're training young people and empowering young people to make a difference in the world in a positive way. And part of, you know, going to school is confronting people from different backgrounds, perspectives, and learning to rumble with tough issues, figure out how you feel as you mature, and figure out how you can be a leader going forward. So we're always supportive of student athletes, you know, using their platform to try to advance the world. We've got a very impressive group of student athlete leaders that meet at the conference level, and they do community service, they talk about activism, and we are a platform to try to enable and support that conversation.
My final topic here, I know that the Autonomy 5 commissioners, you came together, provided a letter to Congress concerning name, image, and likeness. And one of the lines that really stuck out to me was asking, hey, do not wait on the NCAA. Here's where our voices are. We want you to hear from us. What sparked that among the Power 5 commissioners?
Well, we're obviously working very closely with the NCAA. We've got members on all their committees, but we're concerned that there's been a conflating of the work the NCAA is doing with the urgent need for Congress to create preemptive legislation that avoids these state laws. You know, being here in California, I don't think the California state legislature is going to roll back what they did, regardless of what the NCAA decides. So I want to make sure that's clear, that there's a sense of urgency based on states passing laws. The recent Alston decision on appeal, we think it'll be you know, a lot of harm to what people love about college sports if the rules of college sports are decided by state laws and the courts. Secondly, the feedback we've gotten from members of Congress, they want to hear from our schools directly. They're not looking to hear from institutions like the NCAA. You know, every member of Congress represents a certain constituency, and we think it's important that the campuses are weighing in directly. We've got an important voice, being the 65 largest schools in the country, and we want to promote a dialogue directly with lawmakers and our school leaders.
Power conferences over these last 6 years have definitely garnered more power, starting with the Autonomy 5 and your ability to be able to discuss things among your group. And a lot of people out there just kind of assume there's going to come a day where the Autonomy 5 looks the NCAA in the eye and says, we're turning the other way. We're going to go do our own thing. What do you say to that? Not a lot of people are willing to ask that question, but fans talk about it a lot because there's so much change going on in the college athletics world. What do you say to that? Will the Autonomy 5 step away from the NCAA? Is that being discussed at all behind closed doors?
Yeah, that's not anticipated. I think there's a lot of value in having a national organization, for all the national competitions we have at different levels. And it's represented progress for the Big Five conference to have, quote, autonomy and being able to set our own rules around student athlete benefits. The NCAA is a complex organization, a lot of different interests at different levels, not just within Division I, where there's vast differences in the resources and the focus of schools and conferences like ours and others. But, the board of governors of the NCAA also has Division II representatives and Division III representatives. So the realities of what our schools are dealing with when it comes to collegiate athletics, the needs of the student athletes can be very, very different from others. And it's my hope that under the big umbrella of the NCAA, we can continue to operate and have the flexibility to set the kind of policies we need to set for those schools that get the most focus from fans and have the most skin in the game in a certain way. But under the big umbrella, that's certainly what I hope will continue to be the case.
Larry Scott, Pac-12 commissioner, stay safe. Look forward to the football season coming up. And thanks for joining us on Social Distance.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate you having me on.